I have to start today with a mental image that honestly just completely threw me off guard. The source material opens with this travel scene, and we are in Iran.
Okay.
Now, depending on, what news channels you watch or what history you've read, you probably have a specific picture of that region, right?
Sure. You'd probably expect some tension, especially given the geopolitical landscape of the last, 40 years.
Exactly. I was expecting the speaker in our source to say, and here were the crumbled ruins that no one cares about.
Right, that historical Christian sites there might be neglected or maybe even erased.
But instead, he visits these ancient Christian sites and finds the exact opposite. He finds the locals, who are, predominantly Muslim, preserving these ruins with this incredible delicate care.
Wow.
It's not just tolerance, it's reverence. And when he asks them, why are you protecting this? The answer isn't about tourism. It's deeply theological. You
Okay.
tell him, without Christianity, there is no Islam.
That's a fascinating way to frame it. It just flips the usual narrative of conflict completely on its head.
It does. They see the lineage.
Yeah.
They view Christian heritage as the necessary predecessor that made their current faith possible.
And that's a perfect opener for what we're unpacking today.
It really is. We have a lecture that's on the surface about the history of Judaism and Christianity, a relationship that's usually described as, let's say, complicated.
Complicated is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. Fraught might be better.
Fair point.
Hmm.
But the source argues this history isn't just a dusty timeline. It's actually a survival manual.
And that's the key distinction. We're not just talking theology here. We're analyzing history to find tools. We're looking at how the law was a portable technology.
Right.
We'll look at how a type of literature called muxi acted as a psychological weapon. And this is the part that's going to sound like a massive leap.
Yeah.
How this ancient mindset might be what we need to deal with climate change today.
It's a jump. But the source makes a surprisingly compelling case. So let's get into it. The lecture anchors this whole thing on one person to start.
The Apostle Paul.
The Apostle Paul. Now, if you know anything about Western history, you know Paul is the guy who took Christianity from a small Jewish sect and just went global with it.
He's the ultimate bridge builder, right?
Yes, but the source highlights this tragic irony in his life.
It is tragic. I mean, he's trying to connect the Jewish heritage with the Gentile world, but he gets burned from both ends.
Also,
The Roman Empire sees him as a troublemaker, but his own people, the Jewish leadership at the time, they see him as a traitor.
the source details how he's beaten, stoned, dragged out of cities. He's in constant peril, often from the very people he considers his own.
It sounds brutal.
It was. But here's the psychological twist. You'd expect Paul to be bitter.
Hmm.
I mean, if a group of people tried to stone me, I'm pretty sure I'd be done with them.
You'd write them off.
Completely.
Mm.
But Paul writes this letter where he says, and this is shocking, he would be willingly curved and cut off from Christ if it meant his people, the Jews, could be saved.
It's almost impossible to process that. He believes he's found the secret to eternal life, the most valuable thing in the universe.
And he'd trade it.
He'd trade his own eternal soul for the people who are currently hunting him down. It's unrequited love in its purest, most radical form.
The speaker in the lecture actually has a laugh at his own expense here. He admits, look, I couldn't do it. He says he's too short-tempered. He'd hold a grudge forever.
Which I think most of us can relate to. It's a very human moment. But he uses that to make a bigger point about history.
Which is,
Paul had this radical, self-sacrificing love for his roots, for Judaism, but the religion he helped found, Christianity, historically, it did not return the favor.
yeah, this is the dark chapter. The source contrasts that Iranian attitude, respect the predecessor, with the actual history of Europe.
Crusades, pogroms, the whole Christ killers label, it's a history of trying to sever the root.
It's like a software update where you try to delete the old OS.
Exactly. But the whole argument of this lecture is that this hostility is actually suicidal for Christianity. You can't have the fruit if you chop down the tree.
So if the root is essential, we need to understand what that root actually is. This brings us to a trivia question the source poses. If you ask a panel of secular historians what the single most world-changing book in history is, what's the consensus?
The instinct is to say the Gospels, right?
Oh, right.
Or maybe the Quran.
Right. But the source says no. The answer from a historical structural perspective is the law, the Torah, the Pentateuch.
To understand why a book of laws is so revolutionary, we have to talk about this concept the source introduces, Hebraism.
Okay, Hebraism. Break that down for us.
So historians categorize religions. You have low religion, which is basically superstition appeasing local spirits so your crops don't die.
Very local, very transactional.
Then you have high religion or philosophy, like Buddhism or Confucianism. They're profound, but they often don't have a central personal deity who dictates a specific legal code.
And Hebrewism is different.
It broke the mold completely. It introduced a single monotheistic God, which was rare enough. But the kicker is that this God revealed himself through law, through a text, a code.
And there's a specific historical moment where this shift happens, the Babylonian exile.
This is the pivot point of the entire lecture. This is where the survival manual idea really starts. Before the exile, the religion was hardware-based.
The temple in Jerusalem.
Exactly. You go there, you sacrifice an animal, it's a location-based service.
But then Babylon comes in, destroys the temple, and drags everyone away.
Right. So the hardware is gone, the server is down. For most ancient cultures, that's game over. Your god lost, your culture disappears.
Well, that's not what happened.
Not at all. The Jewish people did something unprecedented. They shifted the focus from the temple to the text, from sacrifice to wisdom.
So the book became the temple.
They virtualized the sanctuary. And this is the key takeaway. Portability. A temple can be burned, but a text, you can memorize a text. You can carry it.
It's like moving your data from a physical hard drive to the cloud.
That is a perfect analogy. The cloud of the law allowed them to survive anywhere. And that resilience got tested to its absolute limit a few centuries later.
This is the era of the Maccabees.
Right. The Greeks are in charge, specifically the Syrian Empire, under a ruler named Antiochus, and they decide they are done with this stubborn Jewish minority.
And this wasn't just war. This was an attempt at cultural genocide. The source details the strategy, and it sounds frighteningly modern. First, soft power.
Cultural seduction. Look how sophisticated we are. Don't you want to be Greek?
They built gymnasiums, theaters.
But when that didn't work on everyone, they took the gloves off.
They went for the religious jugular, sacrificing pigs in the holy sanctuary.
Just calculated shock and awe to break their spirit. And finally, military force.
Which leads to the Maccabean revolt. But to explain it, the source uses an analogy I think everyone knows but misunderstands. David and Goliath.
I love this part. We think of it as a miracle story.
The underdog wins through divine intervention. But the source says no, it wasn't a miracle. It was a technological mismatch.
He treats it like a military case study. Goliath is heavy infantry, a tank, covered in armor, carrying a massive spear. He's designed for close quarters combat.
He wants you to get close.
But David is artillery. He's a mobile unit, no armor weighing him down, and he has a projectile weapon, the sling.
Which is not a kid's toy.
Not at all. In ancient warfare, slingers were deadly. They could hit a target from hundreds of yards away. Goliath was a stationary target with a vulnerable spot.
So David didn't play by the rules. He refused to get close.
He fought an asymmetric war. That is the lesson. And the source connects this directly to the Maccabees. The stone they used to take down the Syrian Empire wasn't just guerrilla tactics.
It was a spiritual technology.
Called muxi.
Okay, we need to stop on this word, muxi. In the source, this translates to apocalyptic literature.
Correct. But we need to scrub the Hollywood definition of apocalypse from our brains.
Right, it's not zombies and nuclear winter.
The Greek word apocalypsis just means unveiling or revealing, like pulling a curtain back.
So muxi isn't about predicting the end of the world.
No. The source defines it as resistance literature. Think about the Book of Daniel, written during these exact times. It uses wild imagery beasts, crumbling statues.
That sounds scary.
But it wasn't meant to scare people. It was meant to tell them the truth. It was saying, this empire looks invincible. It looks like a god. But if you pull back the curtain, it is just a beast, and beasts die.
It's a reality check. Don't believe the hype of the empire.
Precisely. It gave people a mental framework to look at a terrifying reality and say, we are not afraid. We are not conforming. It was mind over matter on a civilizational scale.
And that resilience didn't just save Judaism. The source argues it laid the literal groundwork for Christianity to exist at all.
Which brings us to the stepping stones metaphor.
Right. The speaker describes trying to cross a wide, frozen creek in winter. You can't jump it, you need stones.
And the synagogues were those stones.
Oh.
Think about the logistics. When Paul went to spread Christianity to the Roman world, he didn't have to build an audience from scratch.
He didn't just stand in a random market square.
No. Every city he went to, Ephesus, Corinth, Rome, already had a synagogue.
Because of the Jewish diaspora.
Exactly. There was already a community there that knew the scriptures, understood monotheism, and had a moral structure. They were the bridge. Paul could walk in and start the conversation on step 10, not step 1.
So without that Jewish infrastructure, the creek would have been too wide for Christianity to cross.
It would have stalled out. Christianity effectively piggybacked on the network Judaism built.
And the expert in the source throws a bit of a jab here at modern leadership.
He does. He points out that the ancient rabbis were self-funded missionaries who built these communities with grit and their own money. He implies that modern clergy, himself included, are a bit lazy by comparison.
Ouch.
Yeah. We're standing on the shoulders of giants and complaining about the view.
That's a humbling perspective.
Yeah.
So let's recap the toolkit so far. We've got the software, the law,
The resistance tool, Nooksy?
and the hardware, the synagogues. But this is where the lecture takes a hard left turn into the present day.
And this is where the survival manual idea gets urgent.
The source asks a really provocative question. If apocalyptic literature is a tool for resisting empires, what is the empire today?
What is the Goliath trying to wipe us out now?
It's not Rome. It's not Syria.
No. The source argues that the new existential threat is climate change. He calls it the Great Extinction.
And he's not being metaphorical. He lists the specifics: melting glaciers, super typhoons, wildfires.
Pandemics, too.
Yeah.
He references corona, Ebola. He's framing the environmental crisis not just as a scientific problem, but as an imperial threat.
A force that threatens to erase us.
Exactly. An overwhelming power that makes us feel small and helpless.
So if the threat is the new Rome, what is the resistance?
The source argues we need a new apocalyptic literature, a new Mooksy.
That's such a strange connection. When people talk about climate change, they talk about carbon credits or electric cars.
Solar panels, policy.
Right. But he's talking about spiritual fortitude.
He's talking about the will to endure. Think back to the Maccabees. They were facing an impossible enemy. Logic said they should surrender. But they had a worldview, a story that told them resistance is possible. We do not accept this ending.
So the source is saying we're paralyzed by the climate crisis because we're playing by Goliath's rules.
Yeah.
We feel small. We read the news and we think, well, it's over.
Exactly. That despair is the victory of the empire. So we need the David mindset. We need a cultural shift that refuses to accept extinction.
Because history shows that policy usually follows culture, not the other way around.
If the culture gives up, the policy won't matter.
It really flips the script on the word apocalypse. It's not about waiting for the world to end.
It's about refusing to let your world end. That is the perfect summary. It's active, not passive.
So, to recap this journey, we started with the surprise of Muslim locals protecting Christian ruins in Iran.
A lesson in honoring the root.
We saw how the law became a portable sanctuary. We looked at how apocalyptic literature was actually a tool of mental resistance.
And finally, we landed on the idea that we need to rediscover that ancient resilience to face our own modern Goliath, the environmental crisis.
It suggests that history isn't just something we study, it's a toolkit we can raid.
The tools that saved a culture 2,000 years ago, community, portable values, and a mindset of defiant hope, might be exactly what we need right now.
So here is the question we want to leave you with today, inspired by this source. If apocalyptic thinking isn't about predicting the future, but about changing the rules of the game so you have a future, what does your stone and sling look like?
In the face of these massive, overwhelming crises, where do you find the leverage to resist despair?
That is the question. It's about finding the stone that fits your hand.
Thanks for deep diving with us today.
We'll catch you next time.